It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. The kind of escape that everyone in the group needed. A break from the stress of their daily lives. A chance to reconnect with nature. They'd rented a small cabin by the lake, nestled deep within the forest. A place so secluded that the world outside seemed to disappear entirely. The crisp, cool air of the early fall was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, a refreshing contrast to the humdrum of their usual routines. 5 friends had come together to spend the weekend at Lake Hartwell, a pristine body of water that stretched for miles beneath a sky dotted with clouds. There was Sarah, the practical one who organized the trip. Ethan, the jokester with a knack for always making everyone laugh. Lily, the quiet, introspective artist. Mason, the outdoorsman who knew how to build a fire with just a few twigs. And finally, Jake, the one who'd rather be glued to his phone but agreed to come along for the weekend adventure. The cabin was old, with a large stone fireplace in the living room and wooden beams that creaked under the weight of time. The walls were covered with old, faded photographs of the lake, depicting serene days when the waters reflected nothing but the sky. No one had mentioned the rumors, not until they were unloading their bags and preparing for the evening. Those who knew the lake's history had learned long ago not to speak of it aloud, but it was easy enough for Sarah to find something when she searched the old bookshelves, a dusty journal from a previous tenant. Her curiosity piqued. She flipped through it, glancing at the faded words written in neat, careful handwriting. Lake Hartwell, she read aloud to the others, was known for its haunting beauty and its troubled past. The others gathered around her, intrigued. Troubled past? Mason asked, eyebrows raised. Apparently, there were some strange things happening around here decades ago, Sarah continued. Something about drownings, a series of unexplained disappearances. People heard strange noises from the lake at night. The room went quiet for a moment. Everyone knew that rumors like this were usually nothing more than local superstition, stories passed down over generations to scare newcomers. But the uneasy silence that followed made Sarah wonder if perhaps there was some truth to it. "Let's not get all spooked already," Ethan said with a grin, trying to lighten the mood. "We're here to have fun, not scare ourselves silly." "He's right," Jake added, already pulling out his phone. "If there was anything to worry about, we'd have heard about it by now. Come on, let's go explore." They decided to head down to the lake, eager to stretch their legs after the long drive. The sun was just beginning to set, casting an orange hue over the still waters, and the first chill of evening began to creep in. The group walked down a narrow, dirt path that wound its way through the trees, the sound of their boots crunching against the earth the only noise in the growing dusk. As they reached the shore, they were met with the kind of serenity they'd been hoping for, quiet, peaceful, almost too perfect. The water was so clear that they could see the pebbles lining the bottom, the occasional fish darting between the shadows of the rocks. The only movement was the soft ripple of the water as it lapped gently at the shore. "This place is beautiful," Lily murmured, her voice almost reverent as she knelt down to take in the scene. She always found something peaceful about nature, especially lakes like this. Calm, reflective, untouched. "Yeah, it's almost too beautiful," Mason added, surveying the surroundings. "I wouldn't want to swim in it, though. Looks too deep." "Too deep?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," Mason replied, pointing out across the water. "This place is known for being way deeper than most lakes around here. They say it drops off suddenly. No one really knows how deep it goes, and the local divers say the bottom's full of stuff." "Stuff?" Sarah asked. "Old sunken trees, forgotten boats," Mason said, shrugging. "Who knows? They just say it's a bit unsettling, that's all." "Okay, we get it," Jake said, pulling off his jacket and throwing it on the ground. "You're not a fan of swimming. I'm going in." The group laughed at his bravado, but none of them followed. Jake waded into the cool water, his feet sinking softly into the mud at the bottom as he went deeper. The others watched for a while, chatting idly, before Sarah noticed something strange. The water, it seemed darker than it should have been. Even though the sun was still setting, the surface of the lake didn't reflect the fading light the way it should have. Instead, it looked almost murky, as though something beneath the surface was casting a shadow. "Jake, be careful," Sarah called out, her voice suddenly tinged with unease. "You don't know what's down there." Jake, already chest deep in the water, waved his hand dismissively. "Don't worry, Sarah. I've swum in worse." But then, something caught his attention. A low, soft sound came from beneath the water. It was barely audible at first, just a faint, eerie whisper. The group fell silent, turning to look at Jake. "What is that?" Lily whispered, her eyes wide. Jake froze, his hand instinctively reaching for something in the water. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, a trick of the wind or the shifting of the water. But then it came again, louder this time, unmistakable. A cry, a faint, desperate sound, like a voice calling out from beneath the depths. Everyone's breath caught in their throats. Jake's face twisted in confusion and then something else, fear. His gaze darted around, looking for something, anything, that might explain what he was hearing. The sound grew louder, more insistent. A voice, broken and desperate, seemed to reach out from the deep. "Jake!" Sarah shouted, her voice trembling. "Get out of there!" But before anyone could react, Jake's feet slipped on the rocks, and he disappeared beneath the water with a splash. "Jake!" Ethan yelled, but there was no answer. The water was eerily still. A moment of absolute silence passed. Then, just as the group started to panic, they heard it again. The cry. But this time it was different, closer, clearer. As though it were right beneath their feet. The lake was waiting, and whatever was in it was waking up. The silence that followed Jake's disappearance was suffocating. Sarah's heart raced in her chest as she leaned forward, peering into the water. But all she could see was the glassy surface reflecting the dying light of the sun. There was no sign of Jake, no movement beneath the water. Just a still, eerie calm that felt almost unnatural. "Jake!" Ethan shouted again, his voice cracking with panic. He took a few steps forward, then stopped. Where the hell did he go? Sarah's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the dock, her knuckles white. She couldn't stop the images racing through her mind. Jake being dragged under the water, pulled by something unseen, something monstrous. It didn't make sense. The lake had always seemed so peaceful, so calm, so perfect. But now, it was as if something had been disturbed. Something old and forgotten had awoken beneath the surface. "Jake!" Mason shouted, his voice growing desperate. He turned to Sarah, his face pale. "We need to get help. We need to—" "No," Sarah cut him off, shaking her head. "We can't leave him. We have to find him. He's still down there." The others were frozen in place, uncertain. The lake was darkening rapidly now, the light retreating from the sky as the shadows of the trees stretched long across the water. The sound of the wind had died down, leaving only the eerie stillness. It felt as though the very world had held its breath. "I'll go in after him," Mason said suddenly, his voice low and determined. "Mason, no," Sarah said, grabbing his arm. "It's too dangerous." Mason jerked away, his eyes blazing with fear and frustration. "You think I'm just going to stand here while Jake's drowning out there? I'm not letting him die." "We can't," Sarah began, but she was cut off by a low, terrible sound. The cry, that same, distant voice from beneath the water. It was louder now, clearer, almost as if it were calling to them, beckoning them closer. The others exchanged nervous glances, but it was Mason who spoke first. "We have to do something. We can't just stand around and wait for it to get worse." Without another word, he started walking toward the water, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth as he went. The others followed hesitantly, but Sarah's stomach twisted with dread. She couldn't explain it, but the thought of going any closer to the water sent a shiver down her spine. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. "What if we just wait?" Lily suggested quietly, her voice trembling. Maybe he'll come back up?" But Sarah could see the doubt in Lily's eyes. None of them truly believed that Jake would just resurface. And the longer they stood there, the more Sarah's gut twisted with an inescapable feeling. Jake wasn't coming back. Mason waded into the water, his eyes scanning the darkening depths. But the lake was silent once more. The cries had stopped. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to breathe again. Maybe it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the wind and the water. But then she heard something else, an unnatural noise, a deep, gurgling sound, as if something huge was moving under the water, something heavy and slow. "Mason, stop!" Sarah cried, her voice laced with fear. "Get out of there!" But Mason didn't hear her. He was already waist-deep in the water, and his face was set with grim determination. Then, without warning, he lunged forward, disappearing beneath the surface in a flash. There was a splash, a sudden burst of foam, and then nothing. "Mason!" Sarah screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the stillness of the lake. The other three stood frozen, their eyes wide with terror, but none of them moved. Sarah felt as though her legs had turned to stone, her mind too paralyzed to act. And then something emerged from the water. At first, it was just a shadow, something long, stretching out of the lake like a massive limb, rising slowly and deliberately. It was dark, too dark to make out clearly, but it was unmistakably large. Too large. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she realized that what was rising from the depths was not something natural. It was something ancient, something monstrous. Her breath caught in her throat as the shadow became clearer. It was a shape that seemed to coil and writhe, something long and serpentine, its scales gleaming in the fading light. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though the very atmosphere was being distorted by the thing that was emerging from the water. And then, like a nightmare that had come to life, it fully revealed itself. The creature that surfaced was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. It had the body of a serpent, but its skin was slick, black, and covered in what looked like barnacles and algae. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were vast and empty, hollow pits that seemed to swallow all the light around them. It had no face, no mouth, but its presence was suffocating. The thing was enormous. As it coiled around the edge of the lake, the water rippled violently, sending waves crashing against the shore. Sarah could feel the air vibrating, the very ground trembling beneath her feet. In the midst of the chaos, she heard something that made her blood run cold. A voice coming from somewhere deep within the creature, a voice that was both human and something else entirely. "Help me! Help me!" It was Jake. His voice, distorted and faint, echoed in Sarah's mind. "Mason!" Ethan screamed, but there was no answer. The thing was the lake. It was the lake, and the lake was hungry. "We have to go," Lily whispered, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to leave. Now!" But Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the horrifying thing that was rising from the water, its movements slow but deliberate. She could hear Jake's voice again, clearer now, filled with anguish. The creature was calling them, drawing them in. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, a deafening sound that seemed to shake the very earth. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she saw it. The thing's massive tail whipping through the water, slamming into the dock with such force that the wood splintered and cracked. The group scattered, scrambling for safety. But Sarah, frozen in place by a mixture of fear and fascination, couldn't look away. The creature's gaze, those terrible empty eyes, seemed to fixate on her, and for a moment, she was sure it knew her name. "Mason! Jake! We have to go!" Ethan shouted, pulling Sarah by the arm. He wasn't looking at the creature. He was looking at the sky, where a storm was beginning to gather. In the distance, the wind picked up, howling through the trees as dark clouds rolled in, blocking out the last of the sunlight. The storm was coming, and with it, the creature's wrath. But it was too late to run. The lake was no longer a peaceful retreat. It was something far more dangerous, and whatever was beneath the surface wasn't going to let them leave. The storm came quickly, a dark wall of clouds that swept across the sky, swallowing the last slivers of light. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a wild animal, while the lake below churned violently. It was as though nature itself was aligning with the dark force that had risen from the water. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, her feet frozen in place. She could still feel the creature's gaze on her, that emptiness in its eyes, cold and all-consuming. The others were already scrambling for the cabin, yelling at her to follow, but she couldn't move. Mason! Jake! The names felt like a prayer on her lips, but there was no answer. Just the howl of the wind, the crashing of the waves, and the distant, horrifying sound of the creature's gurgling breath. Sarah! Ethan's voice cut through the chaos, and before she knew it, he had grabbed her by the arm, pulling her toward the cabin. She stumbled, almost tripping over her feet, but somehow she kept moving. Her eyes stayed on the water, though half expecting the creature to rise from the depths again, its massive form breaking the surface like some terrible nightmare. They burst into the cabin, slamming the door behind them. The wind rattled the windows, and the air inside was heavy with the scent of wood and damp earth. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. What was that thing? What was it doing to Jake and Mason? She tried to ignore the voice in her head that whispered, "They're gone." Ethan turned to her, panic in his eyes. "We need to call the police or—" "The phone's dead," Sarah interrupted, her voice tight. "I tried calling earlier. There's no signal." Lily, who had been sitting by the window, peered out at the growing storm. "The lake's alive. I swear. I saw it moving." "I saw it too," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "What is that thing? Where did it come from? And why is it—" His words were cut off by a loud crash from outside. Something heavy struck the cabin's walls, rattling the windows. A sickening thought crossed Sarah's mind. "It's here." She rushed to the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she pressed her face against it. The storm was too thick to see much of anything, but the lake was still unnaturally still. The creature was gone. For a moment there was silence, the kind of silence that makes you hold your breath. And then she heard it, the faintest cry, a sound so distant, so barely perceptible, that it could have been her imagination. But the moment it reached her ears, her blood ran cold. Jake? No, it couldn't be. Couldn't. She grabbed the door handle, her body moving before her brain could process what she was doing. "I have to go back out there. I have to find them." "Sarah, no!" Ethan yelled, grabbing her arm. "You can't." "I'm not leaving them out there," she shouted, pulling away. Lily stood up, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "It's not safe. We can't fight whatever that thing is. We need to leave. Now." "We can't leave," Sarah said, her voice raw. "Jake, he's alive. I know he is. He's calling for help." "Sarah, listen to yourself," Ethan said, his voice frantic. "This isn't a movie. You're not going to save them. We need to get out of here. It's too dangerous." But Sarah couldn't stop herself. She had to go back. She couldn't let whatever was out there claim Jake and Mason. They were her friends. She couldn't lose them. "I'm going," she said, her voice firm, though her insides were shaking. "Who's coming with me?" None of them spoke for a long moment. Ethan, Lily, and Jake just stared at her, their faces a mix of fear and disbelief. Finally, it was Lily who spoke, her voice small and trembling. "I'll go with you." The relief that washed over Sarah was almost immediate, but it was also fleeting. She wasn't sure what they would find out there, or if they'd even make it back. But there was no other choice. She couldn't leave without knowing what had happened to her friends. The storm raged on outside, but the cabin was quiet now. No more sounds of the creature, just the wind, howling like some great, hungry beast. Without saying another word, Sarah and Lily grabbed their jackets, and the two of them stepped out into the chaos of the storm. The wind slapped them in the face, and the rain poured down in sheets, stinging their skin. The path to the lake was barely visible now, swallowed by the torrential rain and thick mist that seemed to rise up from the ground itself. They moved quickly, staying close to each other for warmth and protection against the storm. The lake was quiet now, but the sense of danger was palpable. It was as if the very air itself had thickened, charged with something dark and unnatural. Every step they took felt heavier, like the ground was pulling them in, trying to keep them there. And then they saw it. The shadow on the water. At first, it was just a ripple barely noticeable. But then the water began to stir, moving in unnatural ways, as though something beneath the surface was twisting and turning. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "No," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "No, no, no." A low, gurgling sound rose from the depths of the lake, and for a moment, Sarah thought she could hear a voice. Jake's voice. It was faint, distorted, as though coming from far away, and yet it felt like it was right beside her. "Help me." It was faint but unmistakable, and it was coming from the lake. "Jake?" Sarah called out, her voice quivering. She felt her heart race as she stared into the swirling, dark waters. Please, she thought. Please don't let it be too late. Without thinking, she stepped closer to the water, her boots sinking into the soft mud. Her eyes were fixed on the spot where the voice had come from, praying that she was not imagining it. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the water, followed by another, and then another. The water erupted in a massive splash, and something large and dark surged toward them, breaking through the surface with terrifying speed. Lily screamed, and Sarah stumbled back in shock. The creature had returned, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark, its massive form coiling around the water like a great serpent. It wasn't just a lake anymore. It was something else, something hungry, something alive. And it wasn't finished yet. The lake wasn't just a body of water anymore. It was alive. Sarah could feel the weight of that truth in her bones, in the very air around her. The thing that had risen from the depths wasn't just some creature. It was a force that was older than the lake itself, older than the land surrounding it. It was something ancient, something forgotten, and it was angry. Lily stumbled back as the creature reared up from the water, its dark, twisting form slicing through the surface. For a moment, the lake was completely still, too still. The storm had died down for a brief second, the wind and rain no longer battering them, as if the earth itself had held its breath. Then the creature's massive body, slick with black scales and covered in barnacles, began to coil. Its long, serpentine body rippled, sending waves across the lake as it moved. The water around it seemed to churn with an unnatural energy, swirling violently in every direction. Its eyes, black, hollow voids, locked onto Sarah and Lily, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The world around them became irrelevant. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She wanted to scream, but the fear was so thick in her chest that it suffocated her words. The creature's body twisted again, its massive coils twisting and tightening like the rope of a great ship's anchor. The water surged violently toward the shore, and Sarah was forced to take a step back as a huge wave slammed into the bank, soaking them both. The air was thick, like it was charged with something dark, something alive. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature dipped back into the water. The lake went silent again, the storm pausing as if holding its breath. What is that thing?" Lily whispered, her voice shaking with terror. "I don't know," Sarah said, her mind racing. "But it's not natural. It's not just a creature. It's like the lake itself. Alive. Jake and Mason. They're still out there," Lily said, her eyes wide with panic. "We need to go back. We need to find them." "We can't go back," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's too dangerous. We need to get help." Lily glanced back toward the cabin, where they had left Ethan, but she didn't move. They both knew there was no help coming. The phone was dead, and the lake wasn't something you could escape once it had its grip on you. The creature's cry echoed from the depths again. Soft, broken, distant. It was the same sound Sarah had heard earlier, but it was different now. The urgency was gone. The cry was filled with something else. Something darker. "We can't leave without them," Sarah said, her resolve hardening despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "We have to try." Lily hesitated for a moment, her breath shallow as she looked at the lake. She had seen the creature rise, and it had made her blood run cold. But Sarah was right, they couldn't leave Jake and Mason out there. "Okay," Lily said, her voice tight with fear. But we need a plan. We can't just go in blindly. Sarah nodded, her mind spinning as she scanned the shoreline. There had to be something they could use to get closer to the lake without being dragged into the depths by whatever was lurking below. She turned, her eyes falling on the overturned boat they had passed earlier that day. It was small, but it would have to do. "We can use the boat," Sarah said, her voice low but determined. "If we get in the boat, we can get out there without being in the water. But we have to be careful. That thing. It's waiting." Lily bit her lip, her eyes scanning the dark water. She could feel the pull of the lake now, that insidious force that seemed to draw everything toward it. The creature's presence was like a weight pressing down on her chest. But Sarah was right. They couldn't leave without knowing what had happened to their friends. "We're not going in alone," Lily said, her voice steadying. "We wait for Ethan." "No time," Sarah said, urgency in her voice. "We can't wait. The longer we stay, the worse it will get. We have to find Jake and Mason now." Lily hesitated, but then she nodded. The decision had been made. They would go together. But the feeling of dread in her gut grew heavier with every step they took toward the boat. The two of them hurried to the overturned boat, grabbing the oars and righting it. The boat creaked under their weight as they climbed in, the wood groaning ominously. The storm was still thick in the air, the wind picking up once more, but now the lake was calm again. Too calm. The creature was watching them, Sarah was sure of it. She could feel its presence like a shadow stretching across the water. "Stay close," Sarah said, gripping the oars tightly as she began to row. The boat cut through the water silently, its movement almost too smooth. The wind howled around them, but the lake was eerily still. As they rowed further out, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the water was growing darker, as if the depths below them were pulling them in. She glanced at Lily, who looked equally unnerved, her eyes darting nervously between the water and the shore. "Do you hear that?" Lily asked suddenly. Sarah stopped rowing, her heart leaping in her chest. The faintest sound was coming from the water. Another cry, this time louder, more urgent. "Jake?" Sarah whispered, her throat tight. The sound was unmistakable. It was Jake, his voice distant and strained. He was still alive, but there was something wrong, something horribly wrong. The boat drifted closer to the center of the lake, where the cry seemed to be coming from. Sarah's eyes darted nervously across the water, searching for any sign of movement, any sign of what was beneath them. And then, in the distance, something broke the surface. A figure, a human figure. It was Jake, or at least it looked like Jake. His body was floating in the water, pale and lifeless, his arms limp at his sides. His eyes were open, but they were glazed over, as though he wasn't fully conscious. The sight sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed Lily's arm and urged her to row faster. "Jake!" Sarah shouted, her voice raw. "Jake! Wake up!" But as the boat drew closer, something changed. Jake's body began to twist unnaturally, his limbs jerking like they were being pulled by invisible strings. His mouth opened wide, but no sound came out. His eyes snapped toward Sarah, but they weren't the Jake she remembered. They were dark, lifeless, hollow. And then, something else emerged from the water. A hand. A massive, twisted hand that shot up from the depths, grabbing Jake's lifeless body and dragging it back into the water with terrifying speed. Lily screamed, the sound echoing through the night, but Sarah could do nothing. Her mind was blank. The water had claimed them, Jake and Mason, gone. And they were not the only ones the lake wanted. From the depths, the creature rose again. It was coming for them. The water splashed violently as the creature surged upward, its massive form breaking through the surface like a nightmare made flesh. Sarah's heart pounded so loudly in her ears that she could hardly hear anything else. The frantic beat of her pulse, the screech of wind, the crack of thunder from the storm above. All she could hear, all she could feel, was the terror that gripped her. Lily screamed as the creature's eyes, cold and empty, locked onto them. The air was thick with a sense of inevitability, as if they had no choice but to meet their fate. It didn't matter how fast they rowed, how far they tried to push away. The creature was already there, its dark, twisting form closing in on them. Sarah's hands trembled on the oars, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The boat rocked violently as the creature's massive body coiled beneath the surface, and for a moment, the water around them seemed to shimmer with an eerie glow. She could feel the temperature drop, the air thickening with every passing second. It was as if the lake itself was suffocating them. "We have to get back to shore," Lily screamed, her voice high-pitched with panic. She turned, her eyes wide with fear, her face as pale as the moonlight reflecting off the water. "Sarah, please, we need to get out of here." "I can't," Sarah gasped, her throat tight with the weight of their hopelessness. "We can't leave them behind." Lily shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "Sarah, please, look at it. Look at what it's doing." The creature's form was barely visible beneath the surface now, a mass of undulating shapes that twisted and churned, impossibly large and yet impossibly fast. Its movements were smooth and liquid, as though it was part of the water itself. It was hunting them. It was waiting for them to make the wrong move. And every instinct in Sarah's body told her that if they didn't get out of the lake soon, they wouldn't get out at all. But it was too late. A deafening roar erupted from beneath them, and before Sarah could react, the boat was violently wrenched from beneath them. The oars flew from her grasp, and she was thrown into the water with a cry. The cold was suffocating, the water pulling at her, dragging her down into the depths. She gasped for air, but the water poured into her lungs, choking her. Her heart raced as she flailed, trying to find her footing in the murky, dark water. She couldn't see anything, only the blackness below and the storm above. The wind howled like a banshee, and she could feel the pressure building around her, as if the lake was squeezing her, forcing her under. A hand grabbed her wrist. "Lily." With a burst of strength, Sarah grabbed hold of her and pulled her upward, gasping for air as their heads broke the surface. The cold was so intense it felt like needles stabbing into her skin. But they couldn't stop. They had to get to shore. They had to survive. "Keep swimming," Sarah shouted, her voice hoarse from the cold and panic. "Don't stop." Lily nodded, her eyes wide with terror, and the two of them fought the current, pushing toward the shore. But the lake was against them. Every stroke felt like it was pulling them backward, dragging them farther from safety. And then it happened. A shape, massive and dark, broke the surface behind them. The creature rose, its eyes glowing like twin orbs of death, watching them from above. Its long, gnarled body twisted as it surged toward them, moving faster than anything humanly possible. The water churned violently, sending waves crashing into them from every side. "Sarah!" Lily screamed, her voice breaking with terror. "It's coming!" The creature's gaping maw opened wide, revealing rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth, each one gleaming in the moonlight. Its breath was a sickening hiss, like steam escaping from a boiling kettle. But there was something else there, something deeper. It wasn't just the creature that was coming for them. The lake itself was rising, the water boiling and churning as though it were a living thing. The boat had been nothing more than a temporary illusion of safety. Now they were trapped. With a final, desperate push, Sarah and Lily made it to the shore. Their bodies were numb from the cold, their limbs aching with exhaustion, but they couldn't stop. They crawled onto the beach, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. But the nightmare didn't end. Behind them, the creature's monstrous form lurched forward, crashing into the shore with terrifying force. The ground shook beneath them as the creature's massive body heaved onto the land. Its great, gnarled limbs dragged it forward, leaving a trail of slime and dark ichor in its wake. It towered above them, its eyes locked onto Sarah and Lily with the cold, unfeeling hunger of something that had existed far longer than anything human. Sarah could feel the pull of the lake, the sense that it wanted her back, wanted her to surrender to it. Her pulse raced in her ears as she struggled to stand, to run, to get away from the creature that was closing in on them. But she was too weak, too broken, too frightened. And then she saw it. The figure on the shore, Ethan. He had come for them. He had been following them, and now he was running toward them, his eyes wide with fear but determination. He had a rifle in his hand. "Ethan!" Sarah shouted, her voice ragged with exhaustion. He didn't hesitate. With one swift motion, he raised the rifle and fired. The sound of the shot was deafening in the quiet night air. The creature recoiled, its body jerking as the bullet struck it. But it didn't fall. It didn't stop. It roared in fury, the sound splitting the night. The earth trembled beneath them as it rose higher, its form shifting like a mass of writhing tentacles, its eyes glowing with pure malice. Ethan fired again, but this time the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it surged forward, its great limbs moving with terrifying speed. "Run!" Ethan shouted, his voice frantic. "Get to the cabin. Now!" Sarah and Lily didn't hesitate. They turned and ran, their feet slipping in the wet sand, their bodies too weak from the cold and exhaustion to move quickly. Behind them, the creature's roar grew louder, more furious, as it crashed toward them. They could hear it getting closer. And then, there was another cry, a cry that was unmistakable. "Sarah!" It was Jake's voice. It was faint, distorted by the water, but it was Jake. He was alive, but that didn't make sense. He had been dragged under the water. They had seen him pulled into the depths by the creature. Had he come back? Or was this something else? Sarah didn't have time to think. She grabbed Lily's arm, pulling her toward the cabin, their feet pounding the ground. The door was close now, just ahead. They were almost there, but the creature wasn't far behind. The cabin loomed before them, a beacon of fragile safety in a world rapidly spiraling into madness. Sarah's lungs burned, her legs heavy with exhaustion, but the pounding of the creature's massive form behind them drove her forward, each step a desperate plea for survival. The door to the cabin was just a few feet away, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough, that even if they reached it, they wouldn't be safe for long. "We're almost there," Lily gasped, her breath coming in ragged, terrified bursts. "Come on! Come on!" The sound of the creature's roar filled the air, growing louder with every passing second. It wasn't just the water splashing against the shore anymore. It was the ground beneath their feet trembling with each movement of the beast. The darkness around them felt suffocating, like the lake itself had come alive and was reaching for them. Sarah threw open the door with all the strength she had left, not even pausing to look back. Lily was right behind her, and the two of them stumbled inside, slamming the door shut with a force that shook the walls. For a moment, they just stood there, panting, their bodies trembling with fear and exhaustion. The cabin was dark and cold, but it was quiet. The oppressive sense of the lake's presence hadn't followed them in. They were safe for now. Sarah leaned against the door, her mind reeling. The rifle shots from Ethan, the creature's fury, the chilling cries from the lake. They all seemed to be swirling in her head, a storm she couldn't escape. Lily collapsed onto the floor, her hands shaking as she wiped the water from her face. What the hell is that thing? What is happening here, Sarah?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her voice raw. She ran a hand through her wet hair, still struggling to make sense of the chaos. "But it's like the lake. It's alive. It's not just the creature. The whole lake is something else." "But Jake, Mason," Lily said, her voice breaking. They're gone, right? That thing. It took them." "Not all of them," Sarah murmured, her heart hammering in her chest as she thought of the faint cry she had heard earlier. Jake. He was still alive somewhere out there. But what was it that had dragged him back from the depths? And why did it call to her now? Lily wiped her eyes, her face pale. "We can't go back out there, Sarah. That thing, whatever it is, it's not going to stop until we're all dead. We have to leave. We have to get out of here." Sarah wanted to agree. She wanted to say that they should just leave to get as far from the lake as possible. But she couldn't. Jake's voice, distorted by the water, was still in her head. It wasn't a normal cry. It was desperate, yes, but there was something else in it. A warning, perhaps, or a plea for help. She couldn't leave him behind. She couldn't leave any of them behind. "We can't leave," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We have to go back for them. For Jake. For Mason." Lily's eyes filled with fear. "Sarah. No. We're not going back there. That lake. It's—" The wind outside howled, cutting off whatever Lily was about to say. The storm had returned in full force, the roar of thunder and the crackle of lightning filling the air. It was as if the storm itself was pushing against them, urging them to leave. Sarah stepped away from the door, her heart still pounding. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The creature, the lake, Jake's voice. It was all too much, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something worse than the monster was out there. Something that would pull them all under if they didn't act soon. "We're going back," Sarah said quietly, her resolve hardening. "I don't know what's happening, but I'm not leaving without them." Lily swallowed hard, her eyes wide with fear. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Instead, she just nodded, the decision made for both of them. As Sarah turned to grab her jacket from the hook by the door, a sound made her freeze. A faint tapping. It was coming from the window. She stepped closer, her pulse quickening, and peered out through the rain-streaked glass. Her heart skipped a beat as her eyes scanned the darkness outside. It wasn't just the wind. There was someone or something standing just beyond the edge of the porch. Jake. But it couldn't be him. He had been dragged under by the creature. This figure was different. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette pulled by unseen strings. "Sarah," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "What is that?" The figure moved closer, dragging its feet in an unsteady, uneven gait. As it neared the window, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The person looked like Jake, but his face was pale, almost gray, his eyes glassy and unfocused. His skin was slick with dark water, and there was a strange, twisted expression on his face. Half a grimace, half something more terrifying. "Jake?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The word felt strange on her tongue, like it didn't belong. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it pressed its face up against the glass, its eyes still vacant, unblinking. And then it smiled. A slow, sickening grin spread across its face, stretching unnaturally wide, revealing teeth that were far too sharp to be human. Lily screamed, backing away from the window, her hands clutching her head in terror. "No, that's not him. It can't be. Sarah. Get away from the window." But Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. There was something familiar about the way it moved, something that didn't fit. It was Jake, but not Jake. It was like the creature had taken him, his body, his shape, and twisted him into something else. The thing at the window banged its fist against the glass, and Sarah stumbled back, the sound of it rattling her bones. It wasn't just Jake. It was a warning. The creature wasn't just hunting them. It was taking them one by one, using their bodies as bait to lure the others in, to lure them all into the depths. "We need to go," Sarah said, her voice sharp with panic. "Now." But before they could move, there was a sound from the back of the cabin. A soft, whispering noise, like the rustle of leaves or the creaking of floorboards. Someone was inside. Lily's eyes widened in terror. "Sarah? Did you hear that?" "I did," Sarah whispered, her throat tight with fear. Slowly, she turned toward the back door, her heart pounding in her chest. They hadn't heard anyone approach. No footsteps, no voices. But now there was something in the house with them. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. And as she reached for the door handle, the whispers grew louder. The whispering was closer now, a soft, eerie rustling, like someone or something dragging its fingers over the wooden walls of the cabin. It wasn't the wind, not this time. The air was too still, too heavy with the weight of their terror. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, and her breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to acknowledge what was behind her. But she couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. Lily was frozen beside her, her wide eyes locked on the back door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She didn't speak, but her body language screamed in fear. She knew it too. They were not alone. "Do you hear that?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, thick with dread. Lily nodded, her lips trembling. "We have to go. We need to leave right now." Sarah glanced back at the window. Jake's twisted reflection was still there, grinning, staring through the glass with eyes that no longer seemed human. The thing was waiting, lurking, and it wasn't just after them. It was after everyone who came close to the lake. She didn't know what had happened to Jake. What kind of monster had he become, or had it just used him as bait to get to them? But she knew one thing for sure. They couldn't wait any longer. The thing outside was just the beginning. Whatever was inside, that was something worse. Slowly, Sarah stepped toward the back door. Each footstep was like an echo in the room, the sound far too loud for her liking. She could feel the weight of the air pressing down on her, thick with something unexplainable. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, like the walls were breathing in rhythm with her. Every sense was heightened. Her skin tingled, her pulse raced, and the weight in the pit of her stomach grew heavier with every second. Lily reached out, her fingers brushing Sarah's arm. "Please, don't open it." Sarah turned to her, and for a brief moment, she saw the raw fear in Lily's eyes. They both knew there was no running. There was nowhere safe left. Not out there. Not in here. She reached for the door handle, her hand trembling, and turned it. The door creaked open, the sound scraping across the silence like nails on a chalkboard. For a split second, Sarah hesitated, her mind racing. What was waiting for them outside? Was it the creature? Another twisted version of their friends? Or something worse, something that had never been human to begin with? But then the whispering came again, louder now, more insistent. It wasn't from outside. It was inside. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The sound wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a voice, low, guttural, but distinctly human. "Sarah, help me." The voice was faint, muffled, as if coming from a great distance. But Sarah knew it was Jake. She was certain of it. That voice, it wasn't the creature's. It wasn't twisted or monstrous. It was Jake's voice, begging for help. Her pulse quickened, and against every instinct that told her to run, she stepped forward, into the darkness. The cabin felt different now. The air was colder. The walls seemed to close in around them, the silence pressing harder, thicker, like something was drawing closer. "Jake?" Sarah called, her voice shaking. She barely recognized it, as if it didn't belong to her. The voice responded, closer now, but no less distorted. "Sarah, don't leave me. I'm here. I'm still here." Lily stepped back, her hands shaking. "Sarah, no. You can't." But Sarah didn't listen. She couldn't stop now. She had to find him. She had to know if he was really alive, or if this was just another trick. Another twisted illusion the lake was using to drag them deeper. The back room of the cabin was dark. There were no lights, only the pale moonlight creeping through the cracks in the walls. As Sarah's eyes adjusted, she could make out shapes. Old, wooden furniture, boxes stacked high, and a few items left forgotten. But nothing felt safe. It all felt wrong. The voice came again, this time much closer. "Sarah?" She moved toward the corner of the room, where a small, dilapidated cupboard stood. The voice was coming from behind it. "Jake!" She whispered again, her heart racing. Her hand reached out, trembling, to pull the cupboard door open. It was stuck. The voice grew frantic, panicked, almost pleading. "Please, Sarah, please. I'm right here." With a final, forceful tug, the door gave way, creaking open. But instead of the person she was expecting, the thing that lay inside was far worse. It wasn't Jake. It wasn't even human. A figure, half-formed, pale and slick with water, emerged from the darkness. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, translucent in places, and where its face should have been, there was only a smooth, shiny surface, like the lake itself. A grotesque, unnatural thing. It was neither human nor monster. It was something in between, something that had never been meant to exist. Sarah stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. The thing rose up, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it dragged itself out of the cupboard. Its fingers were too long, its body too twisted, as if it were still trying to find its form, still struggling to become something that belonged in the world. It reached toward her, its touch cold and wet, like the depths of the lake. Lily screamed, her voice breaking the silence, but it was too late. The thing lunged forward, its body moving too fast, too erratically. It grabbed Sarah by the arm, its grip like ice, dragging her toward the dark corner of the room. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, were empty, hollow, staring into her with an intensity that sent a cold shiver down her spine. "No! Let go!" Sarah gasped, struggling to break free, but the creature's grip was like iron. She kicked and screamed, but its body was all around her now, pressing her into the floor. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The grip loosened. The creature's body froze, as if some invisible force had commanded it to stop. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, tall and imposing. Ethan. He held something in his hands, a jagged, silver knife glinting in the dim light. "Get away from her!" Ethan shouted, his voice low and filled with fury. Without hesitation, he lunged at the creature, plunging the knife deep into its chest. The thing let out a terrible shriek, a sound that was more water than air, more liquid than voice. It convulsed, writhing in agony, before crumbling into a heap of slick, dripping limbs. "Sarah, are you okay?" Ethan's voice was strained, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave. Now." Sarah was too stunned to speak. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The creature had been real. It had been real, and it had been waiting for them. But as Ethan helped her up, a thought flickered in her mind. A chilling, impossible thought. If that thing wasn't Jake, then where was he? And why had the lake left that thing behind? The cabin felt even smaller now, as if it had shrunk in on itself in the wake of what they'd just witnessed. The cold seeped deeper into their bones, and every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside, felt like a reminder that they weren't alone. The thing that had attacked Sarah was still fresh in their minds, its grotesque, waterlogged form haunting their thoughts. Ethan stood over the creature's remains, his chest rising and falling in heavy breaths. The silver knife was still in his hand, dripping with the thing's eerie, translucent blood. But there was no satisfaction in his face, no relief. Just the same look of dread that had haunted him ever since they'd first arrived at the lake. Is it dead?" Lily asked, her voice trembling as she took a step closer to Sarah. Sarah didn't answer at first. She couldn't. Her eyes were still locked on the creature's remains, her mind unable to fully grasp what had just happened. It wasn't just some monster that had crawled out of the lake. No, it was something else, something older, something that had been waiting, patiently, for them to show up. Ethan's hand gripped the hilt of the knife tighter, as if he expected the thing to lunge at him at any moment. "It should be," he muttered, though his voice was thick with doubt. "But I'm not taking any chances." Lily glanced at him nervously. "What do you mean, not taking any chances? You just stabbed it." "That thing wasn't alive in the way we understand it," Ethan interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "It wasn't just some beast from the lake. It was something else. Something unnatural." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. He was right. The creature hadn't just been a mindless predator. It had been something much darker, something twisted by whatever lay beneath the surface of the lake. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Her heart clenched at the thought of her friend, her brother, in all but blood, still out there somewhere. The voice, the whisper that had called her, the look on the creature's face. It had all been a lure, a trap. Jake wasn't gone. He was still down there, calling to her, but not in any way that she understood. Ethan looked at Sarah, his expression softening with concern. I know you're worried about him, but we can't help him if we're dead." Sarah's throat tightened, and she glanced over at Lily, who had pulled away from the group, her back pressed against the wall. Lily's eyes were darting nervously between Sarah and Ethan, her fingers gripping her arms tightly. "I'm not leaving without him," Sarah said, her voice hardening with determination. I know what I heard. Jake is still alive. He's out there, somewhere. I can feel it. Ethan exhaled sharply, his hand dropping from the knife. I'm not saying we shouldn't look for him. I'm saying we need a plan. We need to think this through. That thing, he pointed at the creature's remains, wasn't the only one of its kind. We can't just go rushing in blind. I don't care, Sarah replied, shaking her head. We're running out of time. She turned and walked toward the door. She wasn't going to sit here and wait. Not while there was still a chance to save Jake. Sarah, wait! Ethan called after her, his voice rising with alarm. But it was too late. She was already stepping outside, the cold air rushing over her skin like an icy hand. The night was pitch black now, the storm having passed but leaving the world with an oppressive, suffocating silence. The lake stretched out before them, its waters still and black, like a mirror that reflected nothing. The forest behind them was thick, too dense to see through, a maze of shadows that seemed to close in around them with every passing second. We need to be careful, Ethan said, his voice serious as he stepped out behind her. The creature isn't the only danger out here. Sarah didn't answer. She was too focused on the water, on the horizon where the lake met the sky. Somewhere out there, Jake was still calling for her. She could feel it in her bones. Lily hesitated before following, casting one last glance at the cabin. What if we're making a huge mistake? She asked, her voice small. It's not a mistake, Sarah replied firmly. We're not running from this thing. We're facing it. They made their way down to the water's edge, their boots sinking into the soft mud with each step. The air was damp, and the chill of the night seemed to seep into their skin. The lake was eerily calm now, but it was impossible to ignore the oppressive weight of its presence. It felt alive, like it was watching them, waiting. Ethan stepped forward, scanning the water. We don't know what's down there, Sarah. We can't just dive in. I'm not diving in, Sarah said, turning to him. But I need to know what's beneath the surface. I need to find out what happened to Jake. Ethan shook his head. I don't like this, Sarah. We can't just blindly follow a voice. The lake. It's pulling us in one by one. Sarah ignored him, her gaze locked on the water, her mind racing with thoughts of Jake. The lake wasn't just a place. It was a force, something that had been lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now that moment had arrived. Sarah, Lily whispered, stepping closer. What if the lake's already taken him? What if there's nothing left? Sarah shook her head, fighting back the sting of tears. There has to be a way. I won't give up on him. Without another word, she stepped into the water. The cold hit her like a shock, numbing her legs with every step. The water rose quickly, up to her knees, then her waist, until she was fully submerged, the chill seeping into her bones. She didn't flinch. She had to go deeper. Lily and Ethan hesitated on the shore, watching her. Ethan's face was tense, his hand hovering near the rifle slung over his shoulder, as if ready for anything. But he didn't speak, didn't try to stop her. Sarah kept going, the dark water tugging at her like invisible hands. She didn't know what was down there, but she had to find out. She had to know if Jake was still alive, if there was any hope left. The deeper she went, the darker it became. The water was thick and murky, clouded with the secrets of the lake. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she pressed on, her arms cutting through the water, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, in the darkness below, she saw something, a shape, something moving. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Jake. She could feel it, she could sense him. He was down there, reaching out to her, waiting for her to come closer. But as she moved forward, the water suddenly shifted, and something large, something powerful, brushed against her leg. Sarah gasped, her body going stiff with fear. Something was down there with her, something more than just Jake. The water began to churn violently, as if the lake itself were awakening. Something was rising, and it wasn't human. Sarah opened her mouth to scream, but the water rushed in, swallowing her words. The water churned around Sarah, pulling her deeper, faster. She tried to swim, to break free from whatever was dragging her down. But it was no use. Her arms felt weak, her legs numb, and the cold was suffocating. She had no idea what it was, but the lake had awakened something ancient and powerful, and it wasn't going to let her go without a fight. Through the murky water, she could just make out a shape below her, large, monstrous, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was as if the very depths of the lake had come alive, rising to claim her. She had been wrong to think she could face this alone. Her thoughts turned to Ethan and Lily. They were back on the shore, helpless, unable to reach her in time. But the creature, it wasn't after them. It was after her. She kicked furiously, her body moving against the current. But the creature's grip was inescapable. It was pulling her down, its presence heavy and oppressive, like an endless weight on her chest. "Sarah," she heard faintly, through the roar of the water. Ethan's voice, calling from the surface. But it was too late. She felt the coldness grip her chest, the water swirling around her like a vortex. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she was going to pass out. The lake had already claimed so many before her. Would she be another lost soul, swallowed up by its depths, forgotten? A flash of light pierced the darkness, and Sarah's eyes snapped open. She wasn't alone anymore. A hand, large, rough, and dripping with water, wrapped around her arm. It was Ethan. He had waded in, following her into the lake. His grip was firm, pulling her toward the surface, away from the nightmare below. "Hold on to me," he shouted, his voice cutting through the roaring water. He didn't wait for her response, just kept pulling her upward. With every movement, the darkness seemed to retreat. The creature, whatever it was still down there, but it was fading, retreating into the deep. Sarah's lungs burned for air, but she didn't dare stop. She needed to escape. She broke through the surface with a gasp, her head shooting above the water. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she was alive. She was breathing. Ethan's hand tightened around her wrist as he pulled her toward the shore. She reached for him, her fingers slick with water, her body shaking uncontrollably from the cold and the fear. Behind them, the lake was eerily still again, as if nothing had happened, as if the creature had never existed. But Sarah knew better. She knew the lake had changed them all. It had shown them something they couldn't unsee, something far older and darker than they could understand. They made it back to the shore, collapsing on the damp earth, gasping for breath. Sarah's heart was still racing, her mind still trying to process what had just happened. She looked over at Ethan and Lily, who had followed them down to the water's edge. They were both pale, shaking, but alive. "We need to get out of here," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Now?" Ethan nodded, pulling Sarah to her feet. "We're not staying here another minute. The lake, whatever it is, it's not done with us." They didn't argue. They couldn't. They had to leave. The lake had shown them enough to know that no one was safe. No one would ever be safe as long as they remained in its grasp. As they turned to leave, Sarah looked back once more, toward the dark expanse of water. The moon reflected off the surface, but it no longer felt peaceful. Felt waiting. The lake would always be there, lurking beneath, biding its time. It had taken something from them, and it would never let go. Sarah didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. They would never be the same. The lake had marked them, and its whispers would haunt them forever.